Can we move to the second presentation? It's on climate change. And we have an expert here, Professor Marialena Nikolopoulou, Professor in Sustainable Architecture. And I haven't seen her presentation, but I would expect the presentation, she's in the School of Architecture and Planning, so I would expect the presentation to be about climate change and the built environment.
Thank you very much.
And I need to look for your presentation.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And yes, climate change is such a huge topic, so I try to make it really relevant to our buildings, the built environment, and our cities. So while loading up, and you can also see the challenges of having an academic trying to be concise in 18 minutes. It's a major challenge. The more excited you feel about your work, the harder it becomes to stick to the 8 minutes. So it's very much about climate change today, and I guess there's not a single day where you open a newspaper or the TV and you don't hear about climate change. These are some of the news from what happened last year in terms of the heat wave across Europe, in the UK. We had airport runways melting from the heat. That was a new sort of a headline. And even moving in areas where heat was never an issue. In Canada, temperatures reaching nearly 50 degrees. Now think about it, Canada, it's the snow we worried about, it's the cold, not the heat. And they broke the record 49 point, nearly 50 degrees effectively in Canada. And this is what we've got to look forward to, sadly. And why we should care, why is that important for our building? Well, because buildings really account for a large part of the emissions that contribute to climate change. And our building stock is not prepared for it, and whether it is the heat we're worried about, and then we start having air conditioning units in the most inappropriate places, consuming electricity and making the environment significantly worse with all this heat that they're chucking out in the street, or the fuel poverty aspects in winter. So it really affects both winter and summer. I would like to present a couple of projects, some sort of from the wider region and some international projects we've worked on, just to highlight some of the key challenges. And the first one is the climate change adaptation and retrofitting of a Victorian townhouse in Margate. We were working on with Thanet District Council and Kent County Council, which received external funding. And it was very much about, you have these large properties, most of them HMOs, quite a few of them standing empty. What do you do with them? They're a major resource. You really don't want to knock them down, but they're very energy intensive as well. So how do you adopt them? How do you adopt them in a modern environment, where there are energy issues, environmental issues, and of course, very social concerns. So we really worked with the council, created the brief for an architectural competition to work towards the refurbishment, and I ended up calling the 5-year lab because it was a very sort of a lengthy project. I mean, there were various interventions in the building to improve it, from changing the windows, installing insulation, which was critical in order to improve the conditions inside the house, as well as shading. Shading is the one element that we keep forgetting in this country. In the past, we did not need to worry about it as much, but I suppose as it's fairly recent what happened in the last few weeks, and the heat waves that will be coming towards our way, and it becomes very, very important. And this is really how the building looked after the refurbishment. But of course, as I said, these are large houses. We did not just want to refurbish or having a developer coming, taking it, and then just selling it to the higher bid, to the bidder. That's not what we should be looking forward. So we were working with the concept along with the School of Psychology, and it was actually a vision from the council, which was very impressive. How do you work? How can we start introducing multi-generation living? So the whole way that the house was designed was to actually be able to house 3 different families. And what I'm saying, why I insist on the families rather than just having different flats, is that the house had to remain open. In order for it to function effectively under climate change, that core, the stairs, had to remain open and help with the ventilation, with the cooling, because once you start blocking them off in individual flats and you close the doors, you've lost all this potential for cooling, and it's really what's contributing to the overheating. And that's why it was important to have for the families, so they could leave the door open. They had their own flats, you know, they had their own kitchens at different floors that they could retreat to if they wanted, but they also had this sort of one of the floors was the communal area that the whole family could work together, could get together, and it was a very successful experiment. In terms of how the people responded on the thermal side, as well as the multi-generation side, it was very effective. In winter they found it warm, and in the summer they found it cool, which was also iterated by the figures, and I'm not expecting you to read any of these, but it really highlighted that it was very warm in winter, and in the summer, although we did not have the heat waves we had last year, that was back in 2019, they really stayed with what we would regard as the comfort conditions, so there was no overheating taking place. And it was a very successful experiment. It led to the development of a sustainable heritage toolkit. You know, it highlighted the way of how we can start adapting historic buildings, you know, with our existing stock. And also it will receive various awards from different bodies, you know, from the Academy of Urbanism, you know, from the heritage side, as well as due to the multi-generation aspect, it was also shortlisted for social impact awards. So it really highlighted potential ways forward on the different fronts. Now I would like to move from the buildings to what's happening outside our buildings, and it's also important to forget, particularly when we're talking about high streets or the spaces in between buildings. And I would like just to leave on the screen an extract from the newspaper, from the New York Times. 10 of the sunshine, white shade is a mark of privilege in Los Angeles. And sadly, this is where many of our streets and high streets are moving towards, and where sort of the haves and have not, and it becomes particularly important. You know, quite a lot of research and experience over the years have highlighted that the conditions outside the buildings, the microclimate, really influence what is taking place in the streets, in the parks, in the different areas, and the climatic conditions have a major impact on that. Irrespectively of where you are in the world, it's not just in the Mediterranean country you expect people to behave in one way, and as you move further north, it's completely different. It is the same story we see, but they're just influenced by different temperatures. And it's important to remember as we move forward. Another part is sociocultural influences and people's background. Some of the work we had done was really looking at pretty much identical conditions in different parts of the world, which I appreciate it has nothing to do with our region, but I would like to highlight a key main issue. So in this case, it was Phoenix in Arizona and Marrakesh in Morocco. And as you expect in Phoenix, wherever you go, it's air conditioning. You are in your air-conditioned house, you get to your air-conditioned car, you drive to work to get to the air-conditioned house, to the air-conditioned office. And of course, it's completely the reverse in Marrakesh, where you do not have access to air conditioning. And this leads to different ways of using space, but there is one common element that we saw in both spaces: the need for good outdoor spaces. Because what the graph on the right highlights is that really the people from lower socioeconomic background really depend on the outdoor space, because they do not have this access to air conditioning. They really need the parks, they really need the good streets, sort of the really good shaded environment to retreat when it's very hot and the houses become unbearable. So irrespective of where you are in the world, good public space is essential. It becomes a necessity, actually, and a major aspect for health and well-being. And again, going back to another cover from a couple of years ago, which really highlights the inequalities. And again, we see, this is the case of Los Angeles, 20% of the city's trees effectively, you know, in 5 blocks in 1% of the LA's population, which is crazy if you think about it. So really the poorest neighborhoods where they really need the trees to cool down the spaces, it's less than 10% of the area that has this important resource for health and well-being. And that's another of the projects we're working with a European project at the moment. This is one of our researchers looking at developing innovative forms of shading that you can employ in different parts in the urban environment. And this is, developing a one-to-one scale and testing it in Turin. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got the master planning. Yes, sometimes you have, you've got the luxury of having a huge team that can bring in the specialists. You have the money to test all sorts of proposals. But let's be realistic. In the majority of cases, you do not have this. You have a handful of people. So how do you work? And this is really what the other researcher, Marika, is trying to do, is develop this protocol, these guidelines that will provide the necessary information. Where do you need to access, where do you need to intervene that's going to have the biggest impact? What's the library of resources you have in terms of trees, and how do you distribute them across the street? And then we're talking about inclusive design, but what does it mean? Most of the standards normally look at the average main person of 180 height, and that's how we design our cities for. Whereas the reality is very different. If you've got a mother with a buggy and the children, the toddlers, being very slow walking across the street, or somebody with a walking stick, or somebody with mobility problem, it's going to take them far longer to walk down that street. It means they're going to be exposed to the very unwelcome sunshine in the summer for much longer periods of time. So it becomes essential that all these become criteria in our design process as well. So that was just to give you a flavor. Silvio asked me to put a summary slide of some of the key areas. So really in terms of when we're talking about sustainable design and climate adaptation, we've got the different scales. We've got the building, we've got the urban block or the neighborhood, and then we've got the city scale. And we can really look at the different aspects and interactions. And the emphasis really should be not just on the building stock just for the sake of it, but really on the user, on the person, on the citizen at the end of the day, how they are experiencing the built environment. So we really work with design and retrofitting, or evaluating built environments and how successful they are. And then at the other, the negative side, moving from the building to the open space, how do you work with solutions for the outer climate adaptation and the streetscape? Because at the end of the day, climate change adaptation and social cohesion really should be going hand in hand. Thank you very much for your time. Yes.
So I'm Sri, obviously from Medway Council, and I think we would like to talk to you for ages about the importance of the landscape and mitigating climate change, but also bringing in benefits in terms of biodiversity. The problem we've got at the moment, though, I think once we realise that we need these narrow streets and we need the treescape, it will almost be too late. The problem we've got at the moment is people still, they're not experiencing that quite at the levels in terms of climate change. They like their space, they don't want the tree brushing against their building. We're not the same as San Francisco or somewhere yet. We will be, but I think they appreciate them and they deal with all those issues and they accept those issues because they quite like all the shade rather than burning. But it's also how we take people on that journey now so that we're prepared for when we need it. And I guess that's not maybe your work, it's someone else's work, but actually taking people and making them realise we need to make those sea changes, otherwise we're never going to, by the time we need it,
it will be too late. Yeah. You're absolutely right, and that's why I think it was Catherine that mentioned it earlier. It's not just about working on the people, but work with the people. Yes. Really, you need to make them understand earlier, work with them highly. And I see it even where I live, in sort of the country where I am. We're trying, the country started closing off part of the street, just not streets, just a very busy junction with planters, and the messages on the neighborhood forum. They were overwhelming for the first couple of days. Now they've subsided a bit because they started saying, oh, the only people that will be using it is, the people, selling drugs. You just It's completely the opposite. It's only been for a couple of weeks that the planters are there, but so far it's nice walking every morning, see, you know, mums with their toddlers just playing for a bit, or people just waiting and having a sandwich at lunchtime, because there were no place they could actually sit where there was a bench in a nice environment, not just in the middle of the street behind the car fumes and the lorry fumes, where they could just sort of relax for 5 minutes. And as they start seeing the effect, I think it will, and that's why it's important to work with them wherever possible and have the consultation, genuinely working with them, trying to convince them rather than just saying, this is what we propose to do, and trying to take them on the journey.
Understand the reasons why we're doing it now for the future.
Exactly. And also I think that we already seeing so many problems. I think it was in the news quite a lot what happened. Was it in Plymouth, where the council just cut down sort of the hand mature trees overnight, or the issues they've had in Sheffield, and they're legal, and I think the council eventually had to apologise about, but it was too late, the trees were gone, so many of them. So there is already quite a bit of evidence highlighting that, you know, the people do want the trees as well at the end of the day.
That's why I mean, I think the public are more switched on than local authorities are.
Yes. Yeah.
And that will continue to change, and eventually we will catch up. But I think there's a long way to go.
Yeah, there is, and the insurance companies are not making it easy, because they say, oh no, the trees are going to cause damage, and oh, you know, we'll have to pay for it. So they are making it very difficult. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.